I'm Edward Allport, and this is a series about reading poetry. And so far, we've looked at reading a new poem to yourself and how to put yourself into the right frame of mind for reading and why a special way of reading is needed for poems. But now we're going to look at how to read poetry aloud, which is a bit of a red line for some people. And you may be asked to read someone else's poem, in which case you're going to want to do it justice. But if you write poetry, sooner or later, you're going to want to read it aloud. Even if it's only to one person, the poem is moving out of your head and it's becoming sound. Now, reading poetry to an audience of more than one person or a small group is similar in many ways to any reading or presentation. So I've divided the subject between 3 sessions. The first looks at preparing a poem to be read, any poem, whether it's your own or somebody else's. The next 2 are for people who are not familiar with reading or making presentations. The second one covers the practicalities of preparing yourself to speak to an audience, the information that you need to gather. And the third one tackles the actual delivery itself. Now, if you are familiar with speaking or making presentations or otherwise performing or reading, these second 2 will be old hat. I mean, if you are, you can skip them or you can listen in the smug knowledge that you know it all already. Now, much of the preparation for reading a poem aloud for the first time is similar to the procedure for reading a poem that's new, but it's worth going through the process even if in your head you know the poem well, even if you wrote it yourself. The transition of words in your mind or on paper or on the screen to words that are spoken aloud is quite drastic, and the words and phrases that sounded great in your head or look great on paper may sound clunky when they're spoken. You may encounter some unexpected tongue twisters which you need to work your way around. You may have even written them yourself. And I had this with a poem called Samite, which is one of my Essex poems. And it contains the line, "Ever the traditionalist." And I could not say it. It took me 8 goes to get it right and rehearsing between each one. And even now, I'm not completely confident in it. I could have rewritten it because I've written the poem, but I didn't want to. I like the phrase, but I just couldn't say the line, and I just had to learn to do it. Now, if you follow the same procedure for reading for the first time, you can skip the first 2 stages. If you know the poem, if you know what it looks like, if you know how long it is, you know what it's about, because this time you're focusing on the sound as much as the feel, and the way of the flow of words converts into a flow of sound. And this means that you have to look out for how the meaning flows, which may not be the same way as the way the meter or the lines flow. And the phrases of the sentences which run over 2 lines have to be read for the meaning and not for the meter or the lines. It's called enjambment when this happens, and it's very common in poetry, because if you pause at the end of the line, you can break the flow, even when the end of the line has a rhyme word, because the temptation is to pause and emphasize the rhyme, but it's almost always better to ignore the rhyme and let the phrase run naturally. If you can't ignore the rhyme, or you don't want to ignore the rhyme, remember that words in English that may look like rhymes don't always sound the same, and words that sound the same don't always look like rhymes on paper. And the poet may have different views on what rhymes from what you do. Look out for unfamiliar words or unexpected words so that you don't stumble over them or mispronounce them, particularly proper names. I was ambushed by my vicar a little while ago. The reader hadn't turned up, and he asked me to read from the book, from the letter to the Hebrews, and it contains the name Melchizedek. And I was just as well that I had a look at it and rehearsed it, because it took me a while to get my tongue around Melchizedek. And I was just relieved that I didn't say it for the first time in front of the audience, in front of the congregation, because I'd probably have got it wrong. I said in the previous sessions that my aim in reading a poem is to avoid analysis, to read for the poem. But when you're reading aloud, you have to do a bit of analysis, because you have to know how all the parts fit together, and you have to understand it and know what it all means. I also mentioned that reading a poem is a partnership between the poet and the reader. But when you're reading aloud, you're part of a 3-way partnership with the poet and the listeners, and you have to do some of the work for the listeners. Now, the way I prep a poem is by underlining the key words to remind myself to accentuate them, to extract the meaning, or to emphasize the mood. I mark enjambments and I show changes in volume with hairpins, like musical notation. I also mark pauses where the meaning pauses but the line doesn't. And this is because of another aspect of reading aloud. You don't need to bother with it when you're reading to yourself, and that is that you need to breathe. So you need to mark where you're going to take a breath, preferably at a point where the poem breaks naturally. Don't try to overextend yourself and leave yourself panting and wheezing, and put in big marks so that when you take a breath, you can see at a glance when the next pause is coming. And remember that you're going to be taking shallower breaths if you're going to be sitting down. Always try to read a poem aloud to yourself before you read it to somebody else. Sometimes you may be asked to read something blind, in which case you won't get the chance, but otherwise you should always rehearse, even on your own. It's always a good idea to read anything aloud that you write, just to get the sounds right and make sure that they flow as you want them to, because other people may be reading this after you. And when you've marked the poem up for reading, read it again, following your marks to make sure that they work and the poem works as you intend. Reading aloud also helps you to decide what speed you're going to read at, so it reflects the text that you're reading. And the trick is to avoid going too fast or too slow. Keep it natural. Decide on the speed as part of your prep and try to stick with it. We're going to be looking at that into the next session but one. The temptation when you're reading is to speed up, which is something to avoid, or you'll end up gabbling. But keeping it slow can also tempt a reader to make the reading sound theatrical and magniloquent. And you may think that this gives the reading gravitas, but as a listener, I find that great swooping cadences leave me feeling almost carsick. And also, if people use the same cadence and the same rhythm and the same tone, sentence after sentence, I find it dulls very quickly. So keep sentences going right to the end and don't swallow the last few words. Now, to give you some idea, I'm going to prep a poem that has most of the pitfalls of reading, but is still one of the greatest poems. Certainly one of the greatest love poems in English. It doesn't have a title, it's simply Sonnet 116, and that alone will tell you that it's by Shakespeare. It's a sonnet, so that it has the requisite number of lines. It has 3 4-line stanzas with a regular iambic meter and a regular rhyme scheme plus a terminal couplet. It's very structured. But if you read it following its formal structure, it sounds flat and boring. The first thing is, what's it about? It's about the unchanging nature of love. And the current device that Shakespeare uses is negating negatives, bad things that don't happen. So the word not recurs throughout, and in most cases it needs emphasizing. It's in a 2-part meter, short, long, so it's iambic, but the key words are often not words that have the long, stressed beat in the meter. Look at the first line. The meter suggests that it ought to be, let me not to the marriage of true minds. But the key words here are not and true. Not because he is negating the admitting of impediment, and true because he is emphasizing the quality of the minds. So, underline the syllables that you want to stress. Then it has enjambment because the first line runs into the first half of the second, and the other half of the second line runs right through the third. Indicate the enjambment and mark the ends of the phrases as breaths. Love is not love builds to not and then drops off at the end. Then, how do you say oh no? Should it be oh no? I think it's more emphatic to say oh no, because it connects more smoothly to the next phrase. And the second line seems to have a long beat on tempest, but the distinction he is drawing is between looks and shaken. Shaken is bad, so he negates it with never. So I would put the stress on looks and the start of never and take it off tempest and shaken. I would also suggest an enjambment of the fourth line, taking a break after unknown. The third line has got a word that may be unexpected. What's bark got to do with it? But a bark is just a type of sailing vessel. At least it's easy to pronounce, unlike Melchizedek. Talking of pronunciation, Shakespeare rhymes love with remove and prove, and in the third stanza, come with doom, which may have worked in the 16th century, but it sounds awkward today, and you need to decide what to do about them. I would favour modern pronunciation rather than some cod historic accent. Essentially, you ignore the rhyme and treat it as though it's blank verse. When we get to the third stanza, it doesn't start with the same rhythm as the first two. The first sentence sounds heavier and more emphatic. Every word needs stressing. In the third line, he has another not, negating alters, but I wouldn't emphasize the not because I don't think the negation needs emphasizing, and it would detract from the emphasis on hours and weeks. The poem evolves logically from stanza to stanza. It travels. It has a sort of internal movement and narrative, but it has the most disconcertingly abrupt volta in the last couplet, which doesn't seem to be part of the same poem. In fact, it could be tacked onto the end of almost any love poem and makes just as much sense as it does here. You can read that in a different tone to the rest of the poem, more throwaway. So let's see how this reads as it's marked, see how it sounds. Sonnet 116. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is a star to every wandering bark whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out, even to the edge of doom. If this be error and against me proved, I never writ, and no man ever loved. Of course, by the time you actually come to deliver the poem, you probably won't need the marked up version because all the markings will be in your head. But don't forget to take a copy with you. Don't rely on memory more than you absolutely have to. In this session, I've talked about how we can prepare a poem for reading aloud and how to avoid some of the pitfalls in reading. The objective is to eliminate anything that could interfere with your delivery and the transition of written word into spoken word. And in the next session, I'm going to give advice as to how to prepare yourself for the performance, and it always is a performance. No one can eliminate every risk, but I'll be talking about some of the things that are worth considering. The objective is the same, to eliminate anything that could interfere with your delivery so that you can focus on the delivery without distraction. And I'll see you then.